It's a confusing topic because it's not obvious by any stretch of the imagination why postmodernism and neo-Marxism or Marxism proper would be aligned, because postmodernism is an anti-grand narrative philosophical movement and Marxism is a grand narrative. And so the fact that those two things seem to coexist in the same space definitely needs some explanation. And it's a very tricky thing to get to the bottom of. So we won't get to the bottom of it, but we'll get farther to the bottom of it than I've got before, and hopefully farther than many of you have got before. So let's see what we can figure out here. So I'm going to start with some definitions. I'll return to them as we continue. You know, with philosophical movements, they're often not named by the major thinkers in the movement. They're sort of named afterwards. The name covers a very large range of ideas and actions and perceptions. Like, it's not that easy. People talk about existentialism, for example. It's not that easy to come up with a one-paragraph summary of what constitutes existentialism. My sense for the existentialists is that it's fundamentally a movement that's predicated on the idea, at least in the psychological sense, that you know, Freud tended to attribute human suffering and mental disorder to childhood trauma. It's more complex than that, but that'll do for a quick overview. But the existentialists thought that there was enough suffering intrinsic in life so that it wasn't insanity that was the question, it was sanity. It was how it was possible for people to be sane and let's say normal, for lack of a better word, given that there was brutality and malevolence intrinsic in life, and the fact that you had to rise up as an individual and stand in relationship to that is part and parcel of what constitutes existentialism. And there's all sorts of different people who were thinkers who were existentialist, some of them atheistic, some of them deeply religious like Dostoevsky. But so it's not, I'm using that as an example to show you how difficult it is to bring a set of thinkers under one umbrella. You're bound to oversimplify, but we'll go ahead and oversimplify. Postmodernism, you can think about it as an attitude of skepticism, irony towards and rejection of grand narratives, ideologies, and universalism, including the idea of the objective notions of reason. That's a big one. Human nature, that's a big one. Social progress, absolute truth, and objective reality, all those things being questioned. I kind of think of the head joker at the top of the postmodern hierarchy as Derrida. Foucault is often mentioned, as are a number of other people. Here's some other attributes of postmodern thinking. There's a recognition of the existence of hierarchy, that's for sure. And there's an echo of that idea, the recognition of hierarchy, in the term patriarchy, because of course patriarchy is a recognition of hierarchy. Now, it's a very particular kind of recognition, but the postmodernists also tend to define hierarchy as a consequence of power differential. And so the world they envision, as far as I can tell, is something like it's a sociologically Hobbesian nightmare. So Hobbes thought of, the philosopher Thomas Hobbes thought of the natural state of human beings as every individual in some sense at the throat of every other individual. So that the basic state of mankind, unlike the Rousseauian state of, say, virgin innocence and the primitive Garden of Paradise, was an all-out war of everyone against everyone else, and that required the imposition of a social order to keep peace, essentially. So it's a fairly dark view of humankind. Rousseau, on the other hand, would think of people as intrinsically good and the social order as intrinsically tyrannical. You can actually think about Hobbes and Rousseau in some sense as opposites that need to be paired together in order to get a relatively comprehensive view of human nature. Well, the postmodern view is like the Hobbesian view in some sense, except you want to replace the individual with pyramids of social organization, so hierarchies of social organization that are based on group identity, and that the landscape in which those pyramids exist is one of unbroken enmity and inability to communicate. So it's a very dark view as far as I'm concerned. And I think it's fundamentally wrong in many ways. I mean, it's right in that there are groups of people and there is some difficulty in communication between them, and that power is an element in the formation of hierarchies, but you can't reduce hierarchy or group relationship to those premises. It's too simplified, because people also cooperate. We're also not groups. Many of us belong to many groups. So the actual situation is far too complex to reduce it to that degree. Even though you can come up with a good explanatory story if you do so, it doesn't capture the nuances. And they're not just nuances. It doesn't capture the essence. Now, the thing is that when you make the presupposition that the reason that hierarchies exist is because of power, then essentially what you do is turn every hierarchy into a tyranny. And so if there is a hierarchy, then you assume it's a tyranny. Well, that's really the patriarchy. The patriarchy is hierarchy assumed as tyranny. And that's also just not true, except in pathological hierarchies. So, for example, we know from the psychological literature that the best predictors of long-term life success are intelligence and conscientiousness, in Western countries at least. And, well, that's what you'd hope for, right? More or less, if you wanted even to set up a society, even if you weren't particularly smart or hardworking, you might want to set up a society where intelligence and hard work were good predictors of success, because then the people who were smart and hardworking would produce a bunch of things that you could have if you could trade for them. And of course, that is actually the situation that most of us are in. So, and of course, the other thing about people who believe that hierarchies in the West are only composed of power and tyranny is that their own actions belie that, because whenever they make a decision to interact with that hierarchy, they attempt or to make a purchase or to make a trade, let's say, or to obtain a service of any importance, let's say a medical service, they're going to definitely act as if there are less and more competent people within that hierarchy and seek out the ones that are more competent, obviously, which you don't do. If the hierarchy is only composed of tyranny and power, there's no point in looking for competence. But anyways, in the West and in functioning societies, the hierarchies are basically predicated on competence and not power. And you might say, well, that's pretty naive. It's like, no, actually, it's not very naive. I'm not saying at all that inappropriate power plays don't play a role in corrupting hierarchies of competence. That happens, but generally what happens is if the hierarchies of competence get corrupted enough by power, then they crumble because they can no longer function. So, and the evidence that our hierarchies of competence work is everywhere, because everything around us works all the time. Ayaan Hirsi Ali tells two interesting stories in her book Infidel, which is a great book, by the way. She came from Africa and from a country that wasn't very functional, and when she came to Holland, she said there were two things that really amazed her. And this really struck me, because now and then you get lucky and you can see the world you live in from an outsider's perspective, right? You get to see through someone else's eyes. She said the first thing that knocked her off her feet was waiting for a bus in Amsterdam. And she's standing at the bus stop, and there's a pole there, and there's a digital sign on the pole, and the digital sign says when the next bus is going to come and counts down, and then when it hits 0, the bus appears. And she absolutely could not believe that would happen, that there could be a sign that told you when the bus would come, and that it would change, and the bus would actually appear. And you think, well, yeah, no, that's a miracle, man. That's an absolute miracle. It is. You got to think that through. The amount of timing and organization and reliability, mechanical reliability, and sociological or social organization and dedication on the part of the bus drivers and the entire company and the organization of the whole city and the state to make that possible is absolutely beyond belief, especially when it's timed to, well, perhaps not the second, but to 10 seconds or something like that. That is absolutely beyond belief. And her inability to comprehend that was the correct response. And then the other thing she was amazed by was that you could go talk to policemen and they would help you. That was just a no-go for her, because for her experience was policemen were there to shake you down and hurt you. And so you think, well, I won't dwell on that point any longer. The point is that it's absolutely ridiculous, blind, to make the assumption that the hierarchies in functioning Western democracies are fundamentally predicated on power and tyranny.